Okay, we're back. We're live. This is Jay Fidell on ThinkTech Hawaii. And we're doing a little energy here on Wednesday, because Wednesday is kind of Energy Day. And at 4 o'clock, we'll be doing the State of Energy show with the Energy Policy Forum. But for now, we are talking to one of the most interesting guys in energy. That is Marco Mangelsdorf, who runs ProVision Solar in Hilo. He's on the phone by way of Skype from Hilo. Hi, Marco.
Hi there, Jay. Great to be back with you again.
The same. We ought to have regular conversations. I really appreciate your thoughtful analysis and the fact that you come up with so much interesting data. And the most interesting data, that recently is an email you sent me on July 28th with thoughts about net energy metering and, the interrelationship of that and the utility, HECO, and PV. So I want to explore that with you if you don't mind. So can we look at your email, the thoughts you expressed, and can you tell the people what you have on your mind about those issues?
Well, to be considered these days, obviously, in terms of energy issues across the state, and I'm most focused on and most affected by what's going on in terms of the solar electric industry, principally on my prime island here, the Big Island, but I'm also an analyst of what's going on statewide, and I was looking at some of the numbers for net energy metering, and for those of the audience who don't understand exactly what that means, that essentially is a law that came into effect July 1 of 2001, which allowed homeowners and business owners to install grid-connected, grid-tied solar electric systems, and to be able to get credited, not paid typically, but credited at the full retail rate for whatever solar kilowatt hours, PV kilowatt hours were being produced, hence the word net. So this law went into effect just about 12 years ago, a little longer than 12 years ago. And it was striking to me as I looked over some of that data that in the first several years of net energy metering, there were very, very few people who went and took advantage of that. In fact, by the end of 2003, there were a grand total of 46 registered NEM customers across the entire state. And fast forward that...
But to put that in perspective, that was before the 2008 Hawaii Clean Energy Initiative, and people weren't thinking nearly so much about clean energy then as they did, say, 2008 and following, right?
Absolutely. That essentially when things really started to take off was after the HCEI agreement in 2009, 10, 11, 12 have just been one growth year after the other in terms of PV adoption. And to go from, as I said, 46 by the end of 2003 to by the end of 2012, beginning 2013, there were probably somewhere around 23 to 24,000 net energy metered systems across the state. So clearly there's been a rapid increase in adoption, especially in the past several years.
How many are there now?
There is not a super accurate figure that is being put out on a month-by-month basis, but based on the permit data that I track on a regular basis, my estimate is that there are probably somewhere around 31,000 systems that are either installed by now or have been permitted and will be installed over the weeks and months to come.
So if we stop there, what does this mean? I mean, 30,000 plus. What does it mean in terms of the marketplace, in terms of public opinion, in terms of the effect on the grid and the utility? What does this mean?
Well, I mean, and that is really the key question, not just for my business, of course, but for the industry as a whole. And there are really some countervailing forces going on. We had a monumental year last year where there was more PV permitted last year than the previous 20 years combined. And whereas net energy metering and PV, grid-connected PV in general, has been I won't say marginalized, but relatively on the margins in terms of gross power production as a percentage of feeding into the overall much, much larger grid. It hasn't been much of a concern to the utilities. However, that has changed over the past couple of years or so. So as adoption has increased dramatically, so has the number of PV systems in any given circuit. And in some circuits, in fact, it has reached a level of what the utility calls high saturation that is giving our friends at HECO, HELCO, MECO, and KIUC some cause for concern. because, as you can imagine, any utility grid operator necessarily needs to know how much power is feeding into that grid from one or more or multiple sources. And when it comes to distributed generated systems, in other words, rooftop systems from 1 kilowatts to 10 kilowatts to 50 kilowatts or larger, this is a type of technology that does not lend itself to easy control in terms of what or how much power is being fed into the grid at any given moment in time. I mean, the utility certainly controls how many systems are installed, because you can't hook up to HECO, HELCO, MECO, or KIUC, at least not legally. You can't hook up unless you enter into a binding legal agreement with them.
Yeah, but all you know then is the number of systems. You don't know exactly how much power they're going to try to give you under the net energy metering.
That is correct. That is correct. But the utility operators are obviously watching their dials and their screens on a 24-hour basis, and they can see the effect of PV systems on a given circuit, especially as that given circuit becomes more and more highly saturated. So, whereas the financial inducements to go PV, from both a cost of electricity standpoint to federal and state tax credits, and the fact that people want to be more green, want to be more energy independent, has led to a massive increase in adoption in PV over the past several years. But the flip side of that is more and more of a concern on the part of our utility friends as to where should they necessarily draw some rather firm and hard red lines.
Well, before we go to those lines, you, in your email to me, you said you had an attached schedule that demonstrated that the loss for new net energy metering installations installed at the end of 2012 was $12 million and change. I guess that's per annum. How do you get there? In other words, what is the effect of the net energy metering process? How does it lead to that loss?
Well, let me first state that particular figure was not one that I came up with. That is actually the figure that HECO came up with as an estimate for HECO, HELCO, and MECO in terms of lost revenue, as I understand it, if I understand their methodology correctly, that when you have X number of net energy metered systems, which of course they have on their books, they can calculate, that represents essentially a loss of revenue to them as they are crediting people for the solar power produced at the same rate, the same retail rate that they are in fact charging them and their non-net energy metered neighbors.
So this is when the customer returns the power. HECO itself in the past would be generating that amount of power itself. Now when the customer returns the power, the HECO has not generated that power. It's been generated by somebody else, so they can't sell their own power. Is that what you're saying?
That's part of the equation. I mean, the other important part is that whenever any business is involved in, let's say, purchasing or crediting a particular product at the same rate that they're charging for it, I mean, that obviously is going to be a net loss.
Yeah.
You don't make a profit doing that. You don't stay in business ultimately doing that.
Well, how did we get to that? I mean, is this something that was just handed down as a legacy way back in 10 years ago at the end of 2003, that it seemed to be a good idea at the time and it just got perpetuated now for the past 10 years, but actually it's not a good formula to pay the retail price for net energy metering?
Well, that is a very juicy and political question, Jay, and it really, in my opinion, before net energy metering took off as it did over these past 3 or 4 years, it wasn't much of an issue in terms of lost revenue to the utilities. So they made a decision going into this that, at least for the time being, this is something that they and their shareholders and their investors would essentially eat over time.
You know, another problem with that, though, is that if you let more and more people enjoy the fruits of that analysis, then more and more people are wedded to it. And I think the magic word in what you started to say was political. Because if you have all these people who are enjoying that good price, they're less and less likely politically to allow a reduction in that price.
Well, there's that, and there's also the argument that is being made not only in this state but also across the mainland. I wouldn't call it a backlash so much against grid-type PV as it is a growing concern on the part of many utilities as net energy metering grid-type PV has become more prevalent, especially in places like California, Arizona, and other states on the mainland where PV is so big. It's the fairness argument, which is that the more people you have getting net energy meter systems, the more that essentially puts at a disadvantage, an unfair disadvantage, all those non-net energy metered customers who are essentially indirectly subsidizing the net energy metered customers who are receiving this type of benefit, which they are not.
This sounds like the old argument that people have been making about PV itself. And maybe we're talking about the same thing. When you're talking about this process over net energy metering, we're really talking about the process all around the installation of photovoltaic, right?
Correct. The vast majority of net energy meter systems across the state and across the mainland come from photovoltaic systems.
Yeah. So, what would be fair here? I mean, if I made you king, and I'd like to do that sometime, what would you do to fix this?
Oh boy. Well, it doesn't lend itself, in my opinion, to any kind of easy solutions. If net energy metering is thought to be a societal good because, in our state at least, because it reduces the amount of imported fossil fuels that must come to the state, it allows us to become cleaner, it allows us to become more energy independent. That is a very tangible value, but at the same time, there are always going to be people who will be able to take advantage of getting a NEM system versus a fair amount of people who will never be able to take advantage of a NEM system on their roof.
So it's an economic issue. It's your position in the economic stratification of society, right? If you're at the low end, you're not going to be able to afford this. If you're at the high end, you can and you will.
Well, and it's important to note as well, just over the past 2 or 3 years, that there have been a bevy of companies that are operating in the state of Hawaii that are able to offer grid-type photovoltaic systems to homeowners at essentially little to no cost, because these companies, whether it's a company out of San Francisco called Sunrun, a company out of Foster City, California called Solar City, and others that essentially are in the business of providing and installing photovoltaic systems on homeowners' roof at no cost to them. Instead, the owner of the system, the Sunrun, the Solar City, the Vivint Solar, they take advantage of all the tax credits, federal and state tax credits, and they in turn pass on a benefit of lower energy costs in the form of solar power sold to the homeowner over a power purchase agreement, essentially. So that has allowed thousands and thousands of Hawaii homeowners who did not have the cash on hand or who did not want to get into a home equity loan or some type of financing, that allowed them to get solar on their roof to be able to ride the wave with little or nothing out of pocket.
So what I was just saying is actually being diffused, and more people in the community, at the low end can now afford it because there's more players in the market, and it becomes available to people who might not have been able to do it before. And you know what? I mean, in January, theoretically, HB 1078, the on-bill financing is supposed to come into play, and that allows a lot more people still, through the financing technique, to put PV on their roofs as well. So that'll expand it even further. What effect is that expansion going to have? If, in other words, more people are going to have PV on the roof, and that's got to affect the remaining pool of people who don't. If there's only one person left in the state of Hawaii that doesn't have PV on the roof, he's going to have to bear a huge burden in maintaining the grid, no?
You take it certainly to the extreme in your example, but the principle is correct of what you say. That is true. Now, the countervailing force against on-bill financing and other means of making it easier financially for homeowners to go PV, the countervailing force is the grid saturation issue.
Yes. Well, that's a
So
serious problem. I mean, in the email you sent me, you said HECO has been very tolerant of the growth of PV. It has sort of bit the bullet on that over the last few years. But the other, perhaps the technological black and white issue is, can the grid accept all this PV power? And at some point, it won't be able to accept it, right?
Well, that's exactly it. And the question is, at what point is that point? And this is something which is garnering a significant amount of attention, not only across our own islands here and our Hiko, Halko, Miko, and Kiaisi and Kauai, but also on the mainland. But I think it's especially pertinent and especially critical and becoming more urgent here, because we've got these, number one, smaller island grids, and number two, they're all independent. They're not hooked up because, at least for the time being, there's not going to be, in the near future at least, any type of underwater cable that's going to be connecting all the islands into one single grid.
Yeah, well, the future is emerging on us. But if I did make you king, as I would like to, what would you change? Would you change? What would you do in the tax credits? What would you do on the rate of buyback under the net energy metering program? And what would you do on the base rate that that everyone has to pay to be connected to the grid? Right now, it's like $16 or $17 or $18, as I recall. What would you do to those things in your role as king?
As king, well, let me address the first part of your question there in terms of the tax credits, which I'm sure you would agree is a very loaded issue, and tax credits typically are, because they are usually targeted, whether they're targeted or not, they usually are beneficial to a small subset of taxpayers and essentially exclude a larger subset of taxpayers. And there's been a substantial amount of discussion over the past years about the rather generous, in my opinion, has been, at least historically, the rather generous state tax credit, which has been on the books now for quite a number of years. And there was an effort, as I'm sure you remember, back in January to May to try to pass a new law in the state legislature that essentially went down, much to the disappointment of many people in my industry, in the first week in May, Senate Bill 623. So it really goes to the question of, what are tax credits supposed to do? Are they there as a temporary hand up, essentially, to get to commercial viability and a scale that allows for significant reduction in costs, and then have the tax credits ramp down, which I think a lot of people would agree that particular position? But the really stunning thing to me, Jay, is that our friends at the State Department of Taxation do not have, at least from what they tell me, they do not have data as of July 31st today that is anywhere close to being accurate as far as how much of a tax hit or how much of a hit on the state's general fund took place in the year 2012. And
that's interesting.
There's a substantial lag, apparently, from when the fiscal year, which is calendar year in this case, when the fiscal year ends, which was the 31st of December, and when DOTAX actually has some data in terms of, well, how much of a hit was there, in fact, on the state general fund from that record amount of PV that was sold, permitted, and installed last year. And according to the person I've spoken to at DOTAX, they don't estimate, they don't believe they'll have that data until perhaps as late as the beginning of 2014. So
this reminds me, it's such a clear reference back to Act 221, the tech research tax credit, back a few years ago. And the big political debate was, how much is it costing the taxpayer? How much is it costing the general fund? And the tax office never really knew what it was. And so everybody was speculating about what it was. And that lack of knowledge, the lack of hard data, made it very hard and actually worked against the credit and the tech industry. And I really hope that doesn't happen again.
Well, what we do know is that the conference committee in early May that was dealing with Senate Bill 623, which is the big hope this session of trying to get a new state tax credit to handle renewable energy technologies is that one or more of the conference committee members was concerned enough about the future cost to the state of the tax credit and the inability to get any type of real and hard data or estimates from DOTAX as to how much that was going to cost, caused them to essentially withdraw supporting the bill, which led to the bill dying in the conference committee.
That's a shame.
Because of that uncertainty of not knowing what the hit was estimated to be.
That's a shame. But putting those considerations aside, if you were looking at this in a macroeconomic way, or sort of a macro energy way, what would you as king do with the credits? Would you sunset them? Would you sunset them sooner or later? Would you extend that sunset so that there's a continuing incentive on into the future? What would you do?
Well, in fact, I wrote an op-ed piece on this in the Star Advertiser that was published back in April with my good friend Jigar Shah, who's been involved in these issues for a number of years as well. And we essentially made the argument that the solar electric industry in the state of Hawaii is of a maturity now based on the dramatic reduction in costs that have taken place over time and the commercialization and mass adoption essentially of this technology, that it was time sooner rather than later to significantly and rather quickly, not over years and years and years, but number one, set a sunset date and make that sunset date sooner rather than later. No one, I think, is advocating, and I'm not advocating, going from 35% to zero from day one to in 1 or 2 years. But there is, in my opinion, go ahead.
Isn't this happening on the mainland? I mean, aren't state tax credits for PV installations sort of sunsetting around the mainland?
Well, it really varies from state to state. There are some states which are more supportive of PV and some that are less. But the really one of the biggest drivers is not certainly state policies, yes, but the fact that there's been a 30% federal tax credit on the books since when was it, 2007, 2008, and that is scheduled to be around at least through the end of 2016. So the fact that approximately 1/3 the cost of the system is essentially paid for by the Fed has been an enormous benefit.
Yeah, it's a cushion. Because even if you don't have the state tax credits, you have a federal tax credit. Well, let me move on to the second one. What would you do to the base rate? That's $17 or so that everybody has to pay for a connection, even if a person has a big PV installation and is not really using the power, and on a net energy metering basis, he really doesn't need to be connected, but he chooses to be connected for, what do we call it, energy security basis. What would you change that rate? Some people have argued it should be increased. Yeah.
Well, that essentially is the minimum customer charge. Whether you are a net energy metered customer and you end up netting zero on a particular month, you actually produce more power than you ended up using, which would mean you're putting essentially banking kilowatt hours in your bank, so to speak. Or whether, for example, you decide you're leaving on vacation for 6 months and you turn everything off in your house, therefore you're not using any power, but you're maintaining your HELCO, HECO, or MECO account, and by regulation and by laws approved by the Public Utilities Commission, as long as you're a utility customer, the utility is entitled to charge you a minimum charge. So whether it's fair to have a net meter customer pay as little as 16, 17 bucks on Oahu, or on this island is typically around $20 a month, I mean, that's just kind of one piece of the overall macroeconomic puzzle in terms of determining some level of fairness across the board as far as electric utility rates, and I can't claim to be privy to the methodology that they've arrived at to charge what they do in terms of the customer charge.
Yeah, but doesn't it need some adjustment? I mean, as you mentioned in your email, 10 years ago there were only a very few net energy metering systems. Now there are 30,000 plus, and the utility has this grid which is only being used for a shrinking cohort of people who don't have PV, wouldn't it be fair to make everyone pay for maintaining the grid instead of having only the shrinking cohort pay? So,
no, I understand your point, and I think in principle I would probably agree with you. But coming up with a mechanism or the methodology to come up with something more fair, that's something that I haven't given much thought to, honestly.
okay, well, let me go to the third one. What about the buyback at the retail rate? It does seem a little onerous for HECO to have to buy it back at the same rate it sells, essentially making no spread on all of this process. I mean, it's got the grid out there. It has to go through all these value-added kinds of things to make this happen, but it has a wash between the buy and the sell, and there's no spread. And what would you do? Would you give it a spread? And how big would the spread be?
Oh, another challenging question.
Well, it's the price of being king,
I would probably delegate it to minds a lot brighter than myself, perhaps like yours, or anybody you would suggest.
Okay, and finally, I know this term usually applies in connection with wind, but what about curtailment? What about saying, I guess the whole interconnection practice and the 15% we can't take more applications for PV that the utility was doing and not doing so much anymore. Would you curtail going forward? Would you curtail installations of PV in order to keep this manageable?
Well, in fact, that is a rather key and critical word these days. And while I certainly can't claim to be completely privy as to what is going on in the inner deliberations of the engineering and management staff at the utility companies, it is my impression that as a possible option to take on and to accept substantially more PV, because I can tell you this, that there are a growing number of circuits in eco territory, MECO territory, telco territory that are at essentially 100% saturation. What I mean by that is that the amount of installed grid-type PV in a given circuit, or PV that has been accepted by the utility company to be installed in a given circuit, that the capacity of that PV capacity, the nameplate capacity, the max capacity, is 100% of the minimum daytime load measured by the utility for that circuit. And let me see if I can make that more understandable. In other words, it's possible if you have 100%, if you reach that 100% mark, that at any given moment during daylight hours, especially around midday, that for that circuit you could have as much PV produced by all the systems in that circuit that equals the minimum demand from the utility at that moment in time. And what that would mean if it were to go over 100% in terms of PV production, that the substations would be seeing a surplus amount of power coming from all those photovoltaic systems, and that presents, in my understanding, a problem to utility operators, because they then have a challenge in terms of what to do with that surplus power.
Yeah.
And
Marco,
spending it up. Go ahead.
I just was going to say we need to take a break, so why don't you finish your thought, and then we will.
Well, this is something I can pick up on after the break.
Okay, we'll take a short break. That's Marco Mangelsdorf. He runs ProVision Solar in Hilo. He writes a lot and thinks a lot, has a lot of op-ed pieces. He's very familiar with this, and I always like talking to him about his thoughts, and he sends me email, and I really enjoy getting that, and I always want to talk to Marco and get his feedback. We'll be right back after this break. We're back. We're live. We're here with ThinkTech on Wednesday. Wednesday is mostly energy. And I'm here with Marco Mangelsdorf of Provision Solar in Hilo by way of Skype. And we always enjoy talking to him about all these issues around photovoltaic and the grid in general. So, Marco, let me take us to another issue for a minute. Somewhere after 2008, we got into these discussions about the feed-in tariff, and I just want to get your impressions on how well that has done and how that affects the issues we've been talking about. How's the feed-in tariff doing in the landscape we've been discussing?
Well, at the risk of not sounding terribly nuanced, it's been my impression that the feed-in tariff has been more or less a fiasco. There was a tremendous amount of well-intentioned and well-thought-out effort put into bringing the feed-in tariff as a possibility for the development of large PV systems to be able to move us in the direction of greater energy independence. But when the system actually launched at the end of 2011, after some fits and starts, what happened on the Big Island, to take one particular example, is that there were a small number of companies that were essentially poised at the ready to, in my opinion, essentially game the system by gobbling up, within days practically, the entire amount of capacity that was reserved for the FIT Tier 2 on the Big Island, which were systems between essentially 20 plus kilowatts to as big as 250 kW.
I remember the notion that the retired couple would put some savings into a little PV farm in their backyard, and they'd make a return on that by selling it under the feed-in tariff to the utility.
Right.
And they'd have a check coming in, every month in the mail, and that was a way you could make, a better retirement for yourself. But what went wrong that it hasn't worked out that way?
Well, as I said, what happened, at least in Helco territory, which I'm most familiar with, is that a number of companies, both based in the state and out of state, were poised and at the ready to essentially get in there when the opening gate went up in December of 2011 and essentially reserve system after system after system after system that rapidly gobbled up the entire capacity for the FIT Tier 2 here on the Big Island within, if not days, and certainly a matter of weeks. So the reality is now, more than a year and a half later, since December 2011, there have been at most roughly a handful of FIT systems that have actually been installed and gone operational here in Helco territory. So there have been dozens and dozens of FIT reservations which have been accepted into the queue, so to speak, that for one reason or another have not become operational. And as far as I know, if you look at both MECO territory and HECO territory, I don't know for a fact how many FIT systems are actually operational right now, Jay, as you and I speak, but I would be surprised if either island had more than perhaps 10 or so.
That is so interesting. After all the time and effort, and I remember that docket took forever, and then there were all these meetings and discussions and negotiations about exactly what it should be. Now we have essentially nothing. And I just wonder, if you have any thoughts about what the lessons are from the feed-in tariff. What do we learn in that process that would be instructive going forward?
Well, and I would suggest that you perhaps try to find, and I can help you with the contact info of this particular fine fellow. His name is Harry Judd, and he works for a company called Axion, which is based over on the East Coast, and they were essentially contracted by the PUC to oversee the FIT program. And Harry's a very interesting guy, very, very, very sharp, and he would have all sorts of interesting observations to make, I'm sure, about how the FIT system was designed, how it was supposed to work versus how it actually has worked. And there have been a number of reviews by PUC and by Axion to try to weed out people who they felt were essentially squatting on the queue list, or who somehow, their systems or their proposed projects were not of a bona fide enough nature that they got bumped off the queue. But
will that help? I mean, if we did this again, or took a look at trying to make it work, and we made conditions and try to exclude people who are inappropriate applicants for the program, would that improve things? Could we start again that way?
Well, we could, and I don't want to be too harsh to the companies who have, in a number of cases, who put a substantial amount of time, effort, and money into developing projects that haven't been able to move forward because of grid saturation issues.
Yeah.
So then, there again, we come up against
same thing.
With the same kind of roadblocks, again, not because I believe the utilities are necessarily intrinsically obstructionist, but because, again, look at the example of the Big Island, where there have been dozens of 250 kilowatt systems under the FIT Tier 2 that have been proposed for the southern part of the island in the Kau area and South Kona, that has comparatively little grid infrastructure to be able to accommodate to 1, 2, or a dozen 250 kilowatt systems there. So,
well, that's a question I want to throw at you for the last few minutes, and that is, we seem to have come a distance relative to, say, 2008, about how well the grid works and how much the grid can handle. And I think for a while we were fairly uptight about that, and we were, maybe overcautious, maybe for a while. Now things seem to be more liberal about it. But is there technology going on that makes the grid more resilient, more accepting of additional energy from photovoltaic and other renewables? I mean, we know there's no storage yet. So how is it that we can seem to accept more without curtailing? How does that work?
Well, we are in fact reaching a point collectively, at least utilities in this state, where curtailment is quite possibly going to be the easiest, quickest, most cost-effective interim solution to be able to accept a significantly larger number of PV people who want to put PV and hook up to the grid, as we collectively work on longer-term solutions, whether it's pumped hydro, whether it's battery storage, or something else that allows the utility to be able to accept a lot more PV. But what I believe is quite possible is that in the months, if not year to come, that there may be essentially a tiered net energy metered program where people who are allowed, new customers, new homeowners, new business owners who are allowed to connect to the grid, they will be allowed to do so under the express understanding that the output of their systems may be curtailed under certain conditions, which would effectively mean that their PV systems would be turned off, would be disconnected from feeding into that person's home or into that business if certain conditions arise with the utility company. So,
well, my understanding is a lot of these companies in Maui, who didn't like the curtailment, had contracts of exactly that nature, where the utility told them, we're not sure about what the boundaries are, we may have to curtail you, so be on notice of that and build that into your financial modeling for how you're going to make your investment and set your price. But when it came down to it and the curtailment happened and continued to happen, those companies were nevertheless upset and articulated a complaint about the curtailment. So the problem is you could write curtailment, fair notice of curtailment into these contracts, both commercial and residential, but when people actually get curtailed politically, they don't like it. And so that provision may not be, at the top of mind at the time it happens.
Well, you're absolutely right. And if you look at the language in the standard feed-in tariff agreement between someone who wants to put a system in and Hiko, Helco, Miko, there is specific provisions talking about the possibility of curtailment.
Yeah.
But to my knowledge, Jay, this has not been an option that has been pursued for net energy metered systems to date.
Yeah.
So if in fact the only way that Helco, Hiko, Miko can go to, let's say, 125% of that circuit's capacity or 150% of that circuit's capacity, if the only way in the short term that they feel they can do that and accommodate significantly more PV systems is to essentially require that the new customers agree to curtailment in principle and in reality, then if they don't agree to it, then they ain't got nowhere else to go.
Yep.
And that's discriminatory in terms of establishing two tiers of NEM customers: those who got in before this started, who don't have to be concerned about curtailment, and those new people who the only way they can put their systems in and connect to the grid have to agree to the possibility of curtailment. So nobody likes that. Nobody's going to like that. But if the alternative is you can't do it, at least in the short term, then it's a tough choice to make.
Yeah. Well, it reminds me of March. March comes in like a lion, kicking and screaming. So does clean energy. Marco, it's been great talking to you. Right after this show, we're going to set up for a radio show, which will also be broadcast on Ustream and Spreaker.com from 4 to 5 with Jeff Ono, the consumer advocate. And I hope you can call in. The number to call in the next hour is 296-5467. We'll be talking about the orders that were recently entered by the PUC. Thank you so much, Marco.
It's always my pleasure, Jay, to be with you. Thanks a lot.
The same. Take care. Aloha.